Okay, well, we're bang on 8. Hi Jill. I think we'll kick things off just as we've got people joining us. Firstly, a really warm welcome to everyone. Good evening and great to see you all here on this Monday evening. And just as we were saying there, we've got people joining us from all around. So we've got people across Australia, but also in the UK, France, etc. So that's fantastic. I'd like to start by saying that we acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So yeah, warm welcome. Tonight's topic is impact investing, what is it and how to get involved. So we've got very pleased to say we've got Trevor Thomas, the Managing Director for EthInvest, who will be speaking. And we're also going to hear from Katerina Gator, who is with AGN. Now, some of you may remember the session we had last year with Simon Sheikh, who was the CEO of Future Super. And that was a great session as well. And there's a significant impact that we can all have via where we invest our money. And this evening session is really part of this sort of theme. And I think, it's something I know is of great interest to many of you. So the format for this evening will be that we're first going to hear from Trevor, and then we're going to open it up to a Q&A session. So as we go, please feel free to add any questions in the chat or just comments. They're always good as well, or just hold on to them. And then when we come to the Q&A bit, we'll come to you and we can get that going as well. And then after that, then we're going to hear from Katerina. So without further ado, I'd just like to introduce Trevor Thomas. So Trevor is the MD for EthInvest. He joined them in 1997 after spending 6 years in South America working in economic development. And prior to that, he was employed as an economist with one of Australia's major banks. Trevor graduated in economics at Sydney University and has an MBA from Eastern University in Philadelphia. And he's been a certified financial planner since 2003. EthInvest was the first financial planning company in Australia with a dedicated focus on ethical investment. And their aim is to work with clients so that their investment portfolios shape and fund the world that they would like to live in. They also have a subsidiary called Australian Impact Investments, which provides advice regarding impact investing. And this aim being to create social and environmental outcomes along with competitive financial returns. So thanks so much, Trevor, and over to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for the invitation to join the meeting tonight. I'm on Gadigal land and delighted to be with you. I will put some slides up just so you don't have to look at my face through the presentation. And Kat and I have put our heads together and we'll try and move through the material that we're presenting at a sort of a cantering pace and then circle back for questions if you'd like to dig any deeper. Just a disclaimer to start with, it's a lot more interesting for you if I mention particular investments by name rather than skirting around and speaking in generic terms. So just let me warn you that I'm not giving any financial advice this evening. This is all just by way of example, talking about opportunities and things that we're seeing out there. Speak to your own advisors if you'd like to do anything dangerous with money. Let me see if I can throw the screen up, throw my screen up, and I'll just get you to confirm that you can see that. Is that coming through now?
Yep, that's good.
Okay, and we'll start that slide. So the team at Australian Impact Investments has helped me put this together. It's a company that we started 7 years ago when a lot of our philanthropic clients started to ask us how to invest in impact investments, and we couldn't find anybody doing research to help us make good decisions. And so we found somebody that we thought was outstanding and built a company around her. That was Kylie Charlton. She's the CEO of Australian Impact Investments, and some call her the godmother of impact investing in Australia, but not to her face. She has a team of 9 people now dedicated to impact investment, and they've helped me put these slides together. Where does impact investing come from? Well, I guess we start by saying that every possible investment that we could think about has an impact, whether inadvertently or by intention. There are all sorts of impacts. Whenever we deploy capital into something, it has an impact. So the question around what's being called impact investing is around intentionality. We'll get to that. We used to use a traffic light spectrum, red, yellow, green. When Ethinvest was set up, the narrative was around ethical investment, and it had come out of a couple of things. The churches and faith-based organisations had always had a little bit of reticence about investing in certain activities in the sort of the moral vice areas, and so had for a long time been filtering their investments to exclude alcohol, tobacco, gambling. That started to mainstream a little bit in the 70s with the anti-Vietnam movement and broadened. And so the first ethical fund set up in the world for public offer fund was the Pax Global Fund in 1971, which was an anti-war fund. And there was a growth through the 70s in funds that were excluding activities that people wanted to avoid. French nuclear testing in the Pacific, apartheid in South Africa, the war effort, other things like that. And so people started to develop what they used to call negative screens. They would screen out things that they wanted to avoid and invest in anything that was left. And it was called ethical investment because it came from values. It was based on people's values, and they wanted their values expressed in the way that their money was invested. And so that's where we've got the red and the yellow on the screen. You're identifying activities and companies which are harming people and planet, and you're trying to exclude those. And anything that's left avoids harm is open for investment. The conversation became a little bit more focused on the environment through the 80s. And in Australia, it was the permaculture movement that really started to catalyse that into some investment products, as well as some overseas fund managers bringing investments into Australia. It was the decade of the hole in the ozone layer, the early conversations around climate change, but also pollution and overexploitation of resources. And so the conversation moved on, and people started to be a bit concerned in the 90s that ethical investment sounded a bit holier than thou, and whose ethics anyway, and is it an investment that's not ethical, unethical? And so it became language that was contested. And the big end of town couldn't talk about ethical investments because what are the ethics of a bank or an insurance company if it's obeying the law and acting within the constraints of the law? Isn't that all it needs to do? And yet there was an appetite amongst institutional investors for being responsible. And so corporate social responsibility, responsible investment, socially responsible investment, sustainable investment, all those labels were tried out in the 90s and going into the noughties. And that's where we started to focus a little bit more on the green, not just screening out the bad stuff, but proactively looking to put your money into recycling, into renewable energy, into education, into things that promote sustainable agriculture and human flourishing. And so there was a focus on green investment, and the big end of town cottoned on about 20 years ago to the fact that you could express these as risks. And so, there are environmental and social risks, and there are also governance risks. And so ESG was born, ESG risk management. And so really for the last 10 to 15 years, ESG has become the dominant narrative and the way that people have spoken about screened investments. So taking into account the risks that a company runs by its activities that might fall foul of regulators in the environmental and social space or the governance space, and the fact that if you can only make money by cheating, by treating the environment or people badly, that you're at risk of being found out and your business model exposed. So now over half the investments, half of investment funds in Australia, led by the big industry super funds, have got some sort of ESG screening on them where they say they take these sorts of things into account. That has prompted a bit of a backlash, particularly coming out of the philanthropic movement and led by the US, for people to say we're not just happy with this level of screening to try and determine where the risks are. We actually want to put our money to work in ways that are consistent with our charitable mission and our purpose. And so as philanthropics, we have a purpose. It might be to promote medical research, it might be human flourishing, it might be environmental concerns, but we're trying to mobilize our donations for good. Can't we mobilize our investments in ways that are aligned and coherent so that we've got that level of consistency across everything that we do with our money. And that's where impact came from and the language of impact developed. And so that's our new light, the blue light, which is positive. And it's the difference between the green light, positive activities, and the blue light, contribute, is that you can make an investment in a company that's really nice. The world's largest metal recycling company is an Australian-based company called Sims Metal Management. If you buy shares in Sims Metal Management, that's an ethical investment in lots of people's eyes. It's doing good things. It's 95% less greenhouse intensive to recycle ore than it is to mine it and turn it into metal. So Sims Metal is seen as an ethical investment. But if you invest in that company, you buy shares off somebody else. The company doesn't get the money. Somebody else gets the money. And so you're making an aligned investment, but your money's not actually going into anything new or additional. And the difference with impact investment is your money is actually going to projects that are additional, where something's happening only because you're investing in it. And that's where that conversation about impact has sort of led us to today. Interestingly, and for those of us who have come out of the ethical movement and believe that the values base is really important, there's been a lot of criticism in the last couple of years about greenwashing in the ESG space, and the fact that ESG analysis is a bit loose and rubbery, and people have made all sorts of claims about how they take ESG risks into consideration and ended up with portfolios that make the specialists scratch their heads a little bit. So there's been a bit of pushback from the regulators around language and claims around ESG. There's been some actions taken, some penalties handed out. The US has said, and Europe has said, that they will start standardizing the way that these things have to be reported. And as a result, very interestingly, some of the biggest fund managers in Australia are now pulling their ESG statements so they don't get sued for getting it wrong. In the impact space, we think that's a good thing. We think that authenticity and transparency is the sort of the key of ethical investing and impact investing. Can I let you guys keep your eyes on the chat and I'll just keep going through the talk? Is that all right? Yep. Okay. So what are impact investments? Impact investments are made into companies, organisations and funds with an intention to generate measurable social and environmental impact with a financial return. You do it with the expectation of financial return because that's what separates the investment from philanthropy, which is what Kat's going to talk about. So philanthropy is really important, often is catalytical. Kat's going to talk about that. Impact investing is where you're investing in things where you have a reasonable expectation of getting your money back, perhaps with a return. And that return could be somewhere on a spectrum from full market returns to concessional returns, depending on the nature of the project and your priorities as a funder. But there's got to be an intention to generate an impact, and there's got to be a desire to measure that impact and report. And if things get tough for the investment, the idea is that you don't compromise on your impact in the environmental or social space to generate the financial return, that you are as committed to the impact as you are to the financial return. So that's the definitions. And then this is a quick graph of the ecosystem, who supports impact investing. There are different players in the market. There are some names there that you'll recognise, some that you might not. There are, on the left-hand side, the dark green, you've got the people who've got money to invest, and there's some big foundations there. Individuals can also be impact investors. Then you've got down the bottom left, you've got investment intermediaries, platforms and funds. So people who are setting up funds that impact investors can invest in. At the bottom right, you've got the organisations and associations that are where impact investors can get together and talk about what they're doing. On the right-hand side, you've got the people who want the investment, who are looking for investments. And this slide was prepared for social enterprises. So that's a small group of social enterprises that are looking for money at the moment. There's a lot more. There are a lot of people looking for impact investors at the moment. It can go from things like sustainable fishing quotas to water in the Murray-Darling Basin, to startup funds for impact investments, green infrastructure, circular economy, a whole range of positive activities fit in that category. And at the top there, you've got education resources that are put together by people like the Social Impact Hub. And then you've got professional advisors. And that's where Australian Impact Investments, the company that we set up, fits in with Impact Gen and a few others. So there's a whole ecosystem that's growing up around this, and those different parts of that diagram indicate the relationships. And really, for the sector to be healthy, we need all of those we need collaboration and cooperation and a little bit of competition within all of those sectors so that good stuff comes through. How do we define what's positive? It's difficult. Ethics has been challenging to get people to agree about what's ethical. So the language that's evolved is around the Sustainable Development Goals put forward by the United Nations. Now, I have a background in aid and development, and I think that's terrible at one level, because these goals were set up for countries and for multilateral development organisations, and they're all about helping people at the very bottom of the pyramid. And often fund managers who want to map their impact categories onto these labels do terrible injustices. So I've seen Medibank Private mapped onto universal healthcare for all, which is a bit of a stretch if you ask me. Anyway, it is a widely recognised framework of positive areas and targets. And so often impact investors are picking up whereabouts they're working on this map to try and make it clear to people what their intentions are, for better or worse. So that's a quick snapshot. I've got a couple of examples that I'm happy to go into, and I'm happy to answer any questions, but maybe it's worth handing to Kat at this point and having her reflect on the philanthropic side of things.
Great, thanks very much, Trevor. Okay, well, shall we? That's fantastic as an overview. Kat, do you want to then jump in, and then we'll maybe come back to you, Trevor, and then we'll go to questions after that. Does that sound good?
Yeah, perfect.
I'm happy with that, but if you'd like to do questions of Trevor first, also.
No, let's over to you, Kat.
All right. Well, I will start by acknowledging that I'm zooming in from Gadigal country, although I usually live and work and play on Boonwurrung country in Naarm, otherwise known as Melbourne. And I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present and any Aboriginal people here tonight. I am the membership.
Can I just introduce? I haven't properly introduced you. Right? Probably.
That's right. You can do
that first. Right. Yeah. Do you mind? Is that all right?
No, not at all.
So thank you, Kat. So Kat is the Membership Development Manager for Australian Environmental Grant Makers Network, AEGN. And previously, Kat was the field organiser and volunteer coordinator for Zoe Daniel, the independent candidate for Goldstein. She was also an advisory board member for the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute and CEO for Climate for Change, amongst other things. Just a bit about the AEGN. They bring together philanthropists who care about the environment with environmental issues that need funding. It also, and Carol and I are both members, it reinforces that far more can be achieved through working together than by acting alone. So the AEGN is a membership-based organisation that was formed in 2009, and it aims to help members become more effective environmental grant makers. So over to you, Kat.
Thanks, Stephen. You've already done the first half of my little, not the first half, but the first little bit of my presentation. I might just add to that. So we are a membership organisation for environmental philanthropists. To be eligible to join, you have to be giving or have capacity to give $25,000 a year or more to any cause, not just environment, but have an interest in giving to environment and or climate, whether that is as a focus area or as a lens over other giving. But we do have a much broader mission than simply to serve our members and help them be more effective. And that is to grow both the quality and the quantity of funding to climate and environment. And I guess it's in that spirit that I'm also here tonight to talk about really the importance of giving in addition to investing, and the way in which that really supports your investments and complements them. And I will also just say that, you know, whilst we work in the larger giving space and larger donations and grants are a really important part of the funding landscape, smaller donations are a huge part of all NGOs, but particularly climate and environment. And there are lots and lots of, the majority of organisations in the climate environment space are small organisations. And I think they have a sort of an average or a mean income of around, I think it's something like $20,000 or something a year. It's really small. So, you know, the smaller donations are equally important. I wouldn't want anyone to think that any donation is not really, really valuable in this sector. We need every single dollar. So the sort of two things I've been asked to speak to tonight are, you know, why is giving really important in addition to investing, and how does it complement that? And how can you know what to give to and how your donations are going to be effective? Which is a huge question. The first question, I think there are really three key reasons why giving is important as well as investing. The first is simply that there are some things that just won't ever make a profit, but we really need, and all of us need to contribute to that as contributing human beings in our society who have the privilege and capacity to do so. An example of that might be research. So much of, you know, we wouldn't be able to do anything on climate and environment if it wasn't for all the research that has gone on to identify the problems and the solutions, and certainly that obviously creates a foundation for a lot of the investing that one might do. The second, as Trevor touched on briefly, is the catalytic nature of that philanthropy can play in the investment space. You know, I was reflecting today, we have never faced a challenge this big or done anything like what we have to do to safeguard our future in terms of climate and environment. And we need to have an environment where we can take risks. We will not find the solutions, we will not innovate in the way we need to unless we can take those risks. And it's really philanthropy that plays that role in funding the new ideas, the ones we don't know whether they'll work, but we have to back to try and find out. So as a catalyst to some of the innovations, which will later then go on to become, some of them at least will go on to become things that will give a return. And the third, which is the one that I'm most passionate about, having come from this background, is the need for system change through advocacy, awareness raising, and social change work. So for all our environmental initiatives to be successful and sustainable, including investments, we really need a favourable political, regulatory, economic and social landscape. You know, I was thinking today, we have known for decades about this problem. I first became aware and concerned back in 1988, and it was certainly an issue well before that. And we've had the research, the science and the technologies to address climate change for many, many years. And yet we're so far behind where we need to be. And that's really because we haven't had the economic, policy, regulatory and social landscapes that we need to enable environmental and climate solutions. In fact, we've had a pretty hostile environment. And sadly, this didn't just happen. Anyone who knows the history of the climate and environment movement will know that it's been engineered by organisations funded by fossil fuel and other vested interests that have spread misinformation and sown doubt and lobbied against the reforms that we need. And it's the work of researchers, advocates, educators, community organisers and activists of all sorts that have finally started to turn that around. And whilst we have a more favourable political landscape at the moment, we can't take that for granted. In fact, it's incredibly fragile, and the vested interests still fund groups that are intent on taking us backwards. So if we are going to protect and build upon the landscape that we've got at the moment, the landscape that will enable investments to be as impactful as possible, then we really have to keep funding and actually increase funding to the people on the front lines that are doing all of that work. just to give you a bit of understanding of the environmental philanthropic sector, in 2022, the AEGN released a report on environmental giving trends. That was the second, I think it was the second of those reports, most recent, and we are doing another one soon. Based on information we had available then, it was estimated that about $200 to $250 million was given in the form of donations to climate and environment, which made it about 2% of philanthropic giving. And since that's the main form of funding to environmental organisations, when you look at overall revenue, environmental organisations make up 0.5% of revenue in the charity sector. So if you look at the top 10 charities by sector, which is a fairly good proxy for sort of how the issues rate, environment sits at 21 out of 25 different categories. The top 10 charities received back then about $40.6 million, which compared to higher education at the top, which received $2 billion. And even compared to arts and culture, which I've always assumed was and is fairly poorly funded, the top 10 charities there received almost double the environmental sector at $77 million. And these are numbers are for the entire sector. So, you know, when we think then about climate and even more about advocacy, there's far less going into those. And then by comparison, we can remember that Clive Palmer, just one person, poured between $60 and $80 million, depending on different news reports, into the 2019 election. And if you remember, not long prior to that, the mining industry spent $20 million on just one campaign to scuttle the Kevin Rudd's mining tax. So when you think that's what the sector's up against, they've done a really good job. But, you know, it's a really big battle that they have. And I guess the other thing to reflect on that is, which is something that's really come to the forefront for me since starting in this particular role, is that as I've spoken to a number of people in the sector, either analysing it or who are giving or not giving, one of the reasons that I've heard that people don't give or give less to environment is that they say that they're putting all their money into investing. And so really I'm here to say today, it's not a zero-sum game. It is really, it's not either or, it's and that the two together will really support one another. The other question that we're often asked and that Carolyn asked me to speak to tonight was, how do you know what to give to and how can you assess the impact of your giving? And that is such a big question. We could do a whole conference on it. I'm just going to make a couple of points. The first one is that in terms of areas to fund in climate and approaches to fund, the AEGN has a report called the Climate Funders Framework, which is really helpful for strategy. It is the full, and for our members, we also offer a one-on-one service to help people work through that and develop a strategy. It is the full version is only available to our members, but we do have a summary version, including a summary of the opportunities and gaps identified in that framework, which is available to everyone upon request. So you're welcome to contact me for that, and I can send that through. Other resources, the other thing we have is a podcast called Giving Their All, which you can find anywhere that you find podcasts. And that's got some really great insights from our members. And another sort of couple of ways that are helpful to, I guess, get started or to be more strategic in your giving, either to join a giving circle. So some of you might know of Groundswell. There's also another one called Sustainable Table and a few others, where you can give funds to pool your funds together and be part of a collective strategic process to identify where to give. And then the other thing you can do is to set up a sub-fund in a public ancillary fund. Earth has one, Community Investment Impact Fund. There's also the Australian Communities Foundation and Australian Philanthropic Services. And that way you can set up a formal structure without too much administrative burden, but also take advantage of the advisors there who can help you to sort of establish some strategy. I was going to see if there were AGN members here tonight. I think there might be a couple, and perhaps call on them as well to share their experiences later on about how they approach funding. But I guess the other thing I really wanted to say is that in terms of the organisations that you fund, you know, a lot of people get really concerned about, oh, how do I know that they're not going to waste my money? Or, you know, how do I know I'm going to have the greatest impact? And, you know, in some situations, it's really easy to measure, or not, maybe not easy, but relatively easy to measure impact. Things like rehabilitating land, eradicating invasive species, things like that are really sort of easier to measure, things that contribute directly to carbon emissions. But in the work that we talked about earlier, in terms of advocacy and community organising, behaviour and attitude change, that's much, much harder to measure. No one's, I think, really found a really great way of measuring that. And certainly it's even harder to attribute change to any one organisation. In fact, I'm not sure if it's even possible. And even more importantly is that coming up with ways to do that and, you know, doing it and reporting on it is an incredibly onerous burden on already under-resourced organisations. And what I've seen working in the sector for over 15 years is that a lot of really crucial work is not being done, or it's being limited in its effectiveness, or organisations are avoiding strategies that they know are really important because they don't think it's going to get funded. And I guess the risk I'm worried about, the much greater risk than your money not being spent well or not to its greater potential, is actually that we will lose the battle against climate change because we're so caught up trying to measure impact that we're funding the things that desperately need funding. And so that's not to say don't do due diligence, but I would spend the time working out the areas that you want to fund and the strategic way you want to fund that. And then just getting to know organisations. Look at their strategies, their theories of change, the evidence behind their strategy and approach, their leadership, their governance. If you have time, try and volunteer with them, but otherwise, you know, even just try giving a little bit to a number of organisations and seeing how that relationship builds over time. So that's where I'm going to leave it for now, and I'm very happy to answer questions.
Thanks so much, Kat. That was great. And yeah, really great compliment to Trevor's presentation as well. If people have got any questions, feel free to add them in the chat or put your hand up. But I've actually got a question for each of you. So Kat, can I start with you? I hope you don't mind me asking, but when you were talking about, or when Stephen was reading about your background, it's been very, before AGN, it's been very grassroots, really. I suppose, hopefully you would agree, it comes across as quite grassroots. And now you've gone to more of the philanthropy sector. What was sort of, what was your rationale for that move? Did you feel that you could have more impact or a different type of impact in somewhere like AGN?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Look, to be honest with you, I think I moved out of, I started and ran a not-for-profit called Climate for Change for 6 years, and I left that because I was burning out. It was an accident that I then got invited to join a little community group called Voices of Goldstone, and little did I know that would
Very successful little group.
Yeah. That became, but you know, after that I was pretty exhausted. So that was one of the things. And I think, but when I remember being in, actually, so the climate movement has an organisation called the Climate Action Network of Australia, where a lot of the organisations coalesce. And I guess it's sort of like the AGN is for environmental philanthropists or ENGOs. And I remember going to those meetings and just, you know, we had very little funding and we were struggling. And that was one of the key reasons I burnt out, was just, you know, trying to survive and do everything on a shoestring and do your job and fundraise. But, you know, talking to all the other the CEOs of other organizations, even the really biggest organizations that had $1 million budgets, it seemed the same. And I heard time and time again that really good projects were being abandoned, that people were burning, and that it was hard to find people in the sector because they were all going to other sectors because of the lack of funding. And actually, Esther Abrams, who used to work at the AEGN, came and spoke at Canna and gave a presentation on Giving Trends report. And I just remember thinking, someone has to do something about this. No wonder we're like this. We're never going to get anywhere. And I think Lily Tomlin has once said that I used to think someone should do something about that. And then I realized I was someone. And so when the job came up at the AEGN, I thought, I have to be someone, really. So that's fine.
Oh, good. Well, I hope you enjoy it as you sort of settle in there and grow in your role. It's interesting that you say that, you know, you were drawn to the AEGN because of I suppose, the impact that philanthropy can have, because that's something that I hear a lot of people that, you know, we know some members of the AEGN and they're part of this group, so some of the others on the call will know them too. But it is often a sort of a core part of the conversation is how can we have the most impact? How can, you know, we really leverage what we have to make the biggest difference? Thank you. Trevor, I've got a totally different question for you. Do you need to have a lot of money to get started with impact investing, and how can sort of regular people get involved? Oh, and I'll just get you to take yourself off mute.
Sorry. Yes, thank you. I think the answer is no, but it helps if you do. The impact investment opportunities that exist in Australia today are often structured as wholesale impact investment opportunities that only wholesale investors can access. And that's because it's much cheaper for people to raise money from wholesale investors. They don't need lawyers to write long product disclosure statements and target market determinations. And so, unfortunately, it has very strongly tilted towards large-scale investments where the minimum investment's $100,000 to get things off the ground. That's starting to change, and fund managers are offering impact investment in their marketing materials, and there are some people who are doing that very well. I'm going to just put in the chat a list of some resources that if people wanted to click through, they'd be able to go and find some more information. The Ethical Advisors Co-op does a sort of a greenwashing guide, where we give a rating out of 5 green leaves to different funds in the ethical and impact space, and they're all publicly available for retail investors. You don't need a lot of money to go into any of those. The Responsible Investment Associations, like a Peakbody, which has also resources to get people started. I'll put Australian Impact Investments in there, which is the company that we started that has got, you know, free resources there, and also the Global Impact Investor Network, just a link there. They've got lots of resources and information. But the key one would be the Ethical Advisors Co-op that does look at some of the impact funds and gives them a rating for sort of being true to label. I just wanted to pick up too, if I could, on something that Kat said around the importance of of your philanthropic dollar and the catalytic side of things. I'm a trustee of 4 different charitable trusts: Eth-Invest Foundation, the Community Impact Foundation, John T. Reid Charitable Trust, and the McKinnon Family Foundation, and all of them are members of AEGN, and all of them have 100% impact investment commitment. It takes time to get there, but we've built diversified portfolios across those 4 entities to try and have impact investments embedded deeply. And we realise that the most powerful dollars that we've got are our philanthropic dollars. They're the ones that really are the magic, where we can go into the highest risk, highest impact areas, which means that we really want to protect them. So if there's a way to assist an organisation that can be structured as a loan or as an investment, where you get your money back, well, you can multiply your impact many times over. So we ask ourselves very seriously, is this kind of investment that we're being asked to put in best structured as a donation, or is there an element of that could be structured as an investment, which would leverage much greater impact over time and protect our philanthropic dollars?
That's really so interesting, Trevor. So I'm not a finance person. I know there are quite a few finance people on the call, so they probably will with you 100%. But hopefully you don't mind me if I just make sure that I've understood. So the wholesale funds really are just for really big dollars, but there is opportunities for smaller investors through the retail opportunities, such as the ones that you've put up. But in your opinion, philanthropic dollars can be even more impactful because of the flexibility that you have with those.
So in answer to your question, the first question, do you need a lot of money? So far, yes, but it's growing. But the really high impact investments where you're starting schools or putting solar panels and batteries in remote Indigenous communities and really getting deeply into the high impact stuff, that they still tend to be structured as investments for people who can afford to put in at least $100,000 a time. So they tend to sort of break to the larger side. But more and more people are talking about impact in their retail funds. And so those guides I've posted in the chat will give you some resources to find those and identify which is good and bad. The second point I made was about the giving and the impact of the fact that if you're going to give away 5% of your capital every year as a philanthropic, that's 1/20th of your money. And if the other 19 times that amount are working for the same outcomes, to end homelessness, to address climate change, to put up solutions, then you are building on your impact. And if you can find investments that generate good outcomes and where you get your money back, that you can deploy again, you've got this multiplier effect, which is why the philanthropic piece, the donation piece, and the investment piece can work very well together and shouldn't be seen as being in competition. There are some activities where you can't get your money back, and so you should make sure that your donations go into those areas, because if there's something that you're supporting which could be supported by a lender, then that's perhaps not the most strategic use of your donation funds.
Fantastic. Thanks, Trevor. That's really good. Now we might just bring Lisa Saunders in here. Lisa, are you there? It'd be great to hear from the other side, if you like. I know you had your own not-for-profit, and just you made a comment there about how even the smallest donations made a big difference. Do you want to just talk about it from the other side?
I actually do. Thank you for the chance. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. So we started a grant, Arnie's Recon, for 3.5 years, and Arnie's was able to save over 5,500 tons of electronics and appliances from landfill in that time. And we started Arnie's with the intention to solve the whole problem, to really tackle attitudes, behaviors, habits. We made it very easy for people to say yes. There was a science behind everything we did, but we had this very hokey, very approachable. And the big thing we did, which was revolutionary at the time, is we were completely free with all our services. And it upended the industry. The ethics and the transparency we brought to our practices of an industry that was traditionally very secretive and closed. We had Anthony Albanese sent around his people from his office to come and they literally just out of nowhere walked into our warehouse, and they could see our entire operations because we were that transparent. And we relied on small donations to operate and to get us through. We were self-funded. And ultimately, Arnie's had to close. We had to close because that particular model was a very expensive operation, and it really did need a couple of $100,000 a year to keep it going. We just started World Recycling, which is it's leveraging partnerships, it's leveraging relationships, both in how we get things and how we recycle them. And so it's a much more cost-effective model. What I wanted to say, there are a couple things. Number one is we received donations as small as $5 and as large as $6,000 from people all along the way. And all of it made a difference. all of it from offsetting fuel costs or tolls. You know, in this particular case, the $6,000 came just recently while we're still getting back on our feet. And so it's enabling us to register our business or get van signage or you know, I built our website. And in this particular case, I really need someone to help us technically, and now we have the money to do so. And so the thing about social enterprises and about organizations like Arnie's is that you're not necessarily investing for a return of money to you. You're investing on the future of the planet.
Yeah, that's
And so a different perspective in where it, yeah, that's the thing I think, you need to get your head around. That finding an organization, like one of the things we're doing now is there's no recycling center in the Northern Beaches, and we are going to set up, again, revolutionizing recycling centers. We're setting up a new kind of recycling center. And, you know, we're going to the community for funding for it because we can't do it on our own. So, you know, everything went to Arnie's, and so we're starting from scratch. And I'm part of SECNA, and I hear it all the time from other social enterprises. Everything counts. And these are, you know, we are small companies that, you know, that we are very efficient in how we work with funding. And so what you find is you get the right people, you connect with the right people. And I think it is a gut feeling. The spreadsheets don't always make sense.
it'd be great.
I personally invested in companies where the spreadsheets made sense and I lost my money, and I have invested in companies where the spreadsheets didn't make sense and did very well. And so
I think it'd be great if you don't mind sharing some of the details of your current endeavor. Perhaps if you've got the website or some details that we could read some more. I think people would be interested if you could put that in the chat.
I'll do that.
Thank you so much, Lisa.
Thanks. Bye.
Lisa, if I could respond as well, just by saying that I think it's both, and I think it's really fantastic that organisations catalyse volunteer efforts and do really innovative things and build different business models and make small amounts of money go a long way. I was in Arnhem Land last week visiting some remote Aboriginal communities to look at projects up there. And in that case, we could mobilise donors to put solar panels and battery storage into communities that would replace diesel and be very helpful. And it wouldn't be hard to convince people that that was a good idea. But I can structure an investment whereby a fund where we could raise $20 or $30 million could do that across many, many communities, and the money would be able to be repaid from the savings on the diesel and recycled through. So over time, that money would have a much greater impact. So there are certain sorts of activities that lend themselves to investment. And there are others where donations are stretched into phenomenal impact, as you were just sharing.
Yeah, thanks, Trevor.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks, Lisa. That's fantastic. Guy, you've had your hand up there. Guy Wilkinson, I might just bring you into the conversation.
Hi there. Yeah, thank you very much for a great time and a fantastic talk so far. This question I can go to either of you, really, Katerina or Trevor. It's often said by investors that there aren't enough viable projects and or companies suitable for impact investments, and I think we've sort of touched on the issue slightly already. I just wondered what either of your opinions on that was, and perhaps with specific reference for impact investment in Australia.
Pat, do you want to have a go at that one?
I feel like that's more Trevor's. I mean, impact investing is more Trevor's space. You go to that. I'm happy to talk in the philanthropic space, but NGO space. But Trevor, you go.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the team at Australian Impact Investments over the last 7 years has looked at many hundreds of investment opportunities. It seems like everybody wants to set up an eco village on the central coast of New South Wales, and all sorts of sustainable agriculture projects. But they have about a 90% knockout rate. So 90% of the opportunities that are shown to them don't have a good impact thesis or don't have a good financial or investment thesis, and so get knocked out. So there is more money chasing opportunities at the moment in Australia, and good opportunities. And So I think that's a very fair question. But what we're seeing is the emergence of funds and capacity and those different organisations I mentioned earlier that are building capacity within the system so that things are maturing. And there's a lot more available now than there was 5 years ago. We're seeing a big ramp up in money going into much larger funds. So at the moment we're part of a raise of $100 million for renewable energy projects, which will be new, accretive renewable energy projects that will be community focused. That's far bigger than most of the projects that we've been invested or looking to invest in that space. So there's substantial growth, but there's still quality issues. And I was going to sort of, a big area for impact investment in recent years has been special disability accommodation. So the NDIS in Australia opens up a market for people with different needs to have purpose-built housing, and the NDIS will subsidise rents. So if you build appropriate accommodation if people are in wheelchairs with lower benches and with wider doorways and things like that, and they're purpose-built for people, then there's a benefit in terms of higher rent that you can charge that's subsidised by the NDIS. And so there is a market, there's about a 3,000 unit shortfall in special disability accommodation. And so a lot of people have marched into that space and are launching these impact funds. And there's a huge difference in quality. You can build to spec and get them classified, but the really good operators are looking at all the other things like the provision of wraparound services, proximity to public transport and other services, a whole range of things that separate the very good operators and the very good projects from those that are just trying to cash in on a government subsidy. So when we're looking at impact, we're really asking the searching questions to make sure that money is going to things that are really high benefit.
Yeah, thanks, Trevor. Thank you very much.
you.
Guys.
Thank you.
Another one for you, Trevor, by the look of it, from Luke here, who says, do you get many companies contesting the rating that you give them? And also, what is more powerful, companies wanting to attract impact investors or companies wanting to avoid being seen as a detractor?
Yeah, we do have fund managers in particular are always incensed when they get a poor rating, when they've got fantastic marketing materials. It's pretty easy to pop that bubble when we show them how we rate the companies that they invest in, and the preponderance of companies with red ratings or yellow ratings rather than green and blue. So yes, it's a conversation, and we're very happy to be in the conversation. We're happy to push fund managers and companies to do better. And if we've got it wrong, we're the first to admit it. We like to be challenged. And if a company can prove that it's doing better things than our initial research showed, then we're very happy to be corrected and to correct the record. I would say, unfortunately, that's happened very few times over the years. Usually where we've had robust conversations with organisations, we've come away not very impressed with their deep down commitment to the sorts of things that they've said that they've been concerned with. So a really important part of the ethical and impact investment space in recent years has been shareholder activism. There are a couple of organisations that we've helped set up that mobilise shareholders to put pressure on companies to meet their lofty claims around net zero, around waste management, around treating people well, and they're good conversations. Bill McKibben, who set up 350.org in America, said, I wrote 8 books about climate change before I realised I wasn't in an argument, but I was in a fight. That, as Kat was saying earlier, there's a range of forces opposed to change, the vested interests in Australia that are very politically active, and if specifically in the environment and climate space, we have to fight very hard to make sure that there's real clarity around who's doing what and who's being effective.
Yeah, the great points. Thank you. Matt's asked Trevor, what are the minimum threshold returns impact investors are currently seeking, and over what time frame?
There's not a single answer, I'm afraid. Some people have portfolios where their giving commitments are such that they need to get a market-based return from all their investments. And so they'll be looking for, if they're putting money into loans, they'll be looking for an interest rate that is comparative with non-impact investments for the risk that they're taking. So if it's a low risk loan, it's a low interest rate. If it's a higher risk loan, they'll be looking for 15 or 20% returns. Equity investors who are investing in shares would, generally be looking for higher returns. So one of the things that we talk about is where people sit on the impact and return spectrum. Some people, as I said, really do need those higher returns, and we would like to say that you can have high impact investments that don't compromise on return, but there are other activities where you can't make commercial returns. And some investors are really prepared to do that, to put their money into things and take a lower than market rate return because the impact is so high. So you might be prepared, if you're really concerned about homelessness, you might be prepared to lend people money to build more houses to provide permanent accommodation for people who are homeless, with a rate of return that was, say, the rate of inflation or 6%, even though as an investor, you might expect 9 or 10% from that sort of investment if it didn't have the high impact. You might be prepared to take a lower return. So it really does vary on who the investor is and what they're looking to do. Our thesis is that we should be able to build portfolios that generate reasonable returns, as in competitive returns, from high impact portfolios that you don't have to compromise. But if you choose to, you're choosing to do something very good.
Thanks so much. I noticed Anne had a question in the chat for Kat, which I know you've answered, Kat, but I just thought it could be interesting to share as well. So Anne was interested in, I think, asking some of the questions around the giving circles, the groundswell, and the sustainable table. So I just wondered, do you mind, I know they're not, they're a little bit outside AGM, but do you mind just explaining how they work?
Yeah, sure. And Trevor can jump in with the public ancillary fund since he'll know more about that than I do. But so I guess there were two types of options that I suggested as a way of, if you sort of can't sit and do all the research yourself. The first was a giving circle, and the two that I mentioned were groundswell and sustainable table, but there are more out there. And as I've put my email in the chat a couple of, I think at least once. So if anyone who wants to email me for more information or more resources or links to things, I'm really happy to do that. The way that they work is that you donate money into a fund. So I think the minimum amount for groundswell is $1,000, but you can do more, that's a year. You put money into a fund, and then organisations apply for a grant, and they have granting rounds throughout the year. Organisations apply for grants. A committee made up of members, so members are the people who contribute to the fund. A committee shortlists those grants, and I think then all members get a chance to vote on them. And I guess the good thing about that is that you know that there's been some rigour around deciding who to give to. But you also, especially if you join the committee, actually get a chance to go through a process of assessing organisations and learning about, sort of how to assess an organisation and make strategic decisions. So that's a great way to get started. A public ancillary fund is, I guess, a bit more of a commitment. It is a form of structured giving where you're setting up a fund to give from year on year. It's less difficult than a private ancillary fund. The administration is sort of done collectively, and there are, I'll hand over to Trevor to talk more about that, and Ethinvest has one, but there are sort of two different approaches that I'm aware of. One, like the Community Impact Foundation, you have your own fund and you really make your own decisions, but there is someone who can help you with that. Whereas other funds have the option of pooling your money into in with other funds and having a separate body, or the advisors make that decision. So I think that's an option that the Australian Communities Foundation offers, as well as your own choice if you want it. So I'll let Trevor speak a bit more about public ancillary funds.
Thanks, Kat.
And you're on mute again, Trevor.
Thank you. A plane keeps flying overhead, sorry. So people with lots of money set up a private foundation, a large foundation, usually that's at least $1 million. People who want to have a permanent giving structure, as Kat said, can have a sub-fund or a giving fund in a public ancillary fund, and the big operators in that space are Australian Philanthropic Services and Australian Communities Foundation. We have our Community Impact Foundation that has 100% impact investments, about, it's a lot smaller, it's only $20 million, about 60 member funds. And people then donate usually a minimum of $50,000 to get the fund up, and you give away at least 4% of the fund every year. So you're giving away the minimum $2,000 a year from that. And the person who's made the donation into the fund gets to direct how those donations are made. So you're still in full control over the donation to your final organisation, but you don't have to worry about doing the investing or doing the administration and what have you. Often people set these up if they have a windfall of, they sell a property they've inherited or bought, a second property, and have a big capital gains tax bill, and rather than pay the tax, they bring forward their many future years of giving and drop it all into a fund and get the tax deduction in the year they need it, and then spread that money out and those gifts out over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. If the money's well invested and you're getting a reasonable return on that money, you end up giving away many multiples more over 20 years than you would if you just gave the money away to your favourite charities up front. So you have the benefit of being able to continue to be generous even if after you stop working, if you've capitalised that through your working life. And so some people really like that approach. And as Kat said, you can either give your money to your favourite charity, or you can join with others and support organisations. And AEGN is a bit of as people who are members of AEGN will know, there's the clearinghouse there, which allows people to be joined together and pool their giving, which can be a great thing to do and really help build community around supporting great projects.
Absolutely.
I might just add to Anne's comment. I think it was Anne who commented about sort of just the difficulty that people have in just making that decision, and don't have the time to do that research. And I recognise that the answers I've given aren't, don't give all of the, aren't a nice clean list to make that decision easier. And I guess what I was really trying to say earlier is, in the end, I've been in the sector a long time. I've very rarely come across an organisation that wasn't working in a space that needed work to be done, that wasn't doing good work, that didn't have good people, that wasn't strategic. The biggest limits on their effectiveness were the lack of funding. And I would say, don't, especially, if it is smaller amounts, don't get too hung up on where you're giving it. Give it. All the organisations are doing great work and need that funding. And, the more you give, the more you'll get to know what you're looking for and build those relationships. And the small organisations do really stretch that dollar, so far. And they're not always the ones that come up in some of the sort of more, from advisors and things like that, because they really fly under their radar as well. So if you've got a connection to an organisation in any way, then, it's worth funding that as well.
Thanks, Kat. I was actually going to say, when you were talking before about Groundswell and that giving circle, I mean, $1,000 is still quite a lot, but what I thought worked really well with that is you've kind of got ownership of what ends up being you feel like you're part of a really big pot, because if 40 people put in $1,000, the giving amount is $40,000. So you're funding something quite significant. And as you said, it goes through a filter, so you can feel that sort of level of confidence that what's made it to the shortlist is going to be a pretty good project. So for a start, probably anyone on the shortlist is going to be a good, going to be really, you can be confident about what you're giving to. And you also kind of just feel like you're part of something a lot bigger. I want to just mention, Jill, I think the first time I went to it, I found out about Giving Circles was when we went to an Impact 100 function, which I think I went to with you. So thank you. And yeah, Stephen's got a different question.
Yeah, I suppose just finishing up to both of you. You've both been involved in this space for a long time, and I'd like maybe Trevor to start with. Where do you think we're heading over the coming few years? And if there's one tip for everybody on this call, what would that be?
I think that there's a maturity that's coming to the finance sector around true to label advertising and authenticity and quality control. I think the regulators are bringing some discipline to that. And I think that's a very powerful thing. And I'm always amazed at how lethargic people are in changing their super. Like 70% of people who are told by their super funds that they're underperforming and they should move funds chose not to do that. So people are very slow to move their money, but it's really powerful. So I strongly encourage people to think about how their money is invested in their superannuation and other investments, and to look at ways in which you can bring that into line with your with the world you want to live in, because the world we invest in today is the world we live in tomorrow. So we're actually responsible for that world in the way that we collectively decide to fund it. And I think the task is urgent around the giving. I'm going to share a link to a podcast that the AGN's put together. Their podcast series is excellent. And the third one on shifting power, the McKinnons, really is about being strategic and powerful in space. So if you haven't listened to it, it's really worthwhile. So yeah, my tip would be to make a decision to look at some of the resources and to do something, to look at where your money's invested, and to not feel overwhelmed and powerless, but to be part of the wave for change, because the quality is getting better.
Yeah, thanks, Trevor.
Thank you.
Yes, well said. And Kat, final comments from you?
Yeah. Oh, I have very mixed feelings. I will say that this week it was announced that we are heading into El Nino, or we're in El Nino now, and sadly I think we're up, if it's not this year, in the next coming years we're going to see some pretty shocking heat related events in Australia, and that's going to get worse and worse. So the urgency is just so present. We are really ticking down to the final minute in our opportunity to act. But as Trevor said, things, it might sound minor, but 15 years ago when I started in this movement, I remember going to a Pilates class and someone commenting on the weather, and which was extraordinarily warm for that time of year. And I said, oh, that makes me so nervous. And everybody looked at me like I was just, a stick in the mud. And I was at the gym the other week, and someone commented on the weather, and the instructor said, that makes me so nervous. And everybody in the room commented on climate change and how worrying it was. And I said nothing. And I think that really does reflect that we have, change is not linear. We at Climate for Change, we used to always talk about that bell curve of change, and that when you hit that tipping point, things can happen really quickly. I really do think we're on the tipping point. And as Trevor said, I would just get involved in any way you can. And I'd second the McKinnon's interview on the podcast. It really goes to show it's not just your money, it's not just your time, it's your skills, it's your influence, it's your networks, everything you can possibly do to affect change. We haven't got time to lose.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you both so much. That was such an interesting and informative session. I've certainly learned a lot and really, really enjoyed listening to you both. So thank you for your time tonight, Trevor and Kat. Really nice to see you, and really nice to see everyone on the call as well. The next couple of sessions we're just still trying to tee up sustainable versus fast fashion, which will either be August or September. Do you want to talk about that?
We've got the editor from AAP, Australian Associated Press, coming to chat about the work that they're doing in regional Australia around the environment. We've also got the CEO for the Climate Council coming to chat about the work that they're doing to influence decision makers in Canberra as well. So lots of good stuff coming up over the coming months.
Thanks, everyone, and we'll wind it up. Lovely to see you all.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye.